All right, Jefferson scales back government. Jefferson believed that the government should protect the rights of the citizens. Beyond that, he wanted the federal government to take a less active role in governing the nation. In addition to cutting the federal budget, he decreased the size of the government departments. With the approval of Congress, he reduced the size of the Army and the Navy. He also got rid of that unpopular whiskey tax. So if you remember yesterday, you had a bell ringer that dealt with this, right? Yes, okay, good. Next, we want to talk about the Sedition Act. Now, this inspired the day before Jefferson took office. He hated this law. So what he did is he pardoned those who were jailed because of this law. He also asked Congress to restore the law allowing foreign-born white people to become citizens after only 5 years of waiting. So before, they had to wait a little bit longer, but now he's saying if you are foreign-born, that means if you're coming as an immigrant, that you would have to wait 5 years to get citizenship. Do we still have to do citizenship for people who are immigrants today? Yes, we do. They have a process they have to go through to get their green card. Or sometimes they come on what we call a work visa. Okay. Oh, y'all need more time? Okay. Okay, we're going to start and look at the Louisiana Purchase. Now, the United States overcame a number of challenges early on, and they wanted to create a stable economic system by setting up the courts, defining the authority of the central government. And so the economy began to grow, and as it started to grow, they needed to have something in place, and their answer was the Louisiana Territory. Americans needed to protect this interest, and how did they do that? President Jefferson pursued buying New Orleans, in order to control important ports, okay? By the 1800s, almost 1 million Americans lived between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. Most of those people were farmers, okay? So when this is something that they needed to produce and move their products. So what they would do is they would rely on the Mississippi River to ship things like wheat and corn. So they would send that down river, and it would go across the Gulf of Mexico, around Florida, to the ports along the Atlantic coast. But in the end, Jefferson decided that he could buy Louisiana. The Constitution, he said, allowed him to make treaties. So they had to find a loophole in order to buy Louisiana with the Louisiana Purchase, because there was nothing in the Constitution that said that you could buy land, but it did say that you could make treaties. Now, the Federalists opposed this purchase. They said it was unconstitutional, and then they feared it would weaken the other states. But the Democrat Republicans, which used to be our anti-federalists, right? Before they become the Democratic Party, this is their second change. That group of people supported it, and the Senate approved the treaty. And therefore, we got to purchase the Louisiana Territory for about $15 million. Which is known as one of the smartest land purchases in history, because it almost doubled the size of the U.S. Are we ready to move forward with the typing? No, I'm going to give you a little bit of time. All right, today we're going to be covering the Louisiana Territory. As we take a moment to analyze the map, I want you to look at that light green. The light green is what was America, right, after the American Revolution. Now I want you to look at the dark green. This is what we purchased for $15 million. Nathan, what do you notice about that map up there?
It made America bigger.
Yes, it did make America bigger. It almost doubled the size of America. Very good. All right, so now we're looking at American shipping faces challenges. After the revolution, American overseas, the trade between them, it grew so rapidly. And they sailed from New England on voyages, and sometimes that lasted about 3 years. So President Jefferson started looking into foreign policy and protecting American shipping. But they needed more sailors. Do y'all remember what impressment is? Oh, that's good. I'm glad you do. Yes, impressment is when they would go out and they would raid these English villages, and they would get these young men to serve in the Navy. Okay? They would also stop the American ships, and they would seize any British sailors that were on those ships. And later they resorted to also taking these American-born sailors, and we call that impressment, because they impressed or imposed their will on these young men. It infuriated the Americans. Okay, Jefferson, we're going to look at next, we're going to talk about a painful embargo. And we'll go to that section in a minute. So while you are typing, if you've already done adding your notes, go ahead and read through them and ask any questions that you might have. A painful embargo. So next we're going to look at this section. Jefferson knew that a small American fleet was no match for the powerful British Navy. And remember, even when we were looking at the American Revolution, they had a strong Navy. So nothing has changed so far. Now, like Washington and Adam, he sought for foreign policy to avoid war. Washington wanted to avoid war with neutrality. So he's going to look for a way to avoid war. And his way is the American embargo. Now, an American embargo is a ban on trade. Now, this actually would hurt trade with France and Britain if we cut off the needed supplies they needed. All right, so our trade is the most powerful weapon we can use in our defense. This came from one Democratic Republican, and they wrote this in the newspaper. In 1807, Jefferson persuaded Congress to impose a total embargo on foreign trade, meaning no trade with any foreign nations. This meant that American traders could not receive goods from European traders, and American traders could not ship their goods to Europe. So this embargo was a total ban, okay? The Embargo Act did hurt France, and it hurt Britain, but it also hurt Americans. There ended up being supplies of sugar, tea, and molasses that was cut off. And then the exports dropped by 80 million in 1 year. Docks in the South were piled high with cotton and tobacco because that was what they produced in the South. So this Embargo Act, it hurt pretty much everyone. So there's probably going to be some change, and we're going to see that looking forward on the next slide. All right, so in 1809, Jefferson admitted, hey, this is a total failure. And Congress replaced it with the Non-Intercourse Act. So what that meant is that Americans were able to carry on trade with all nations except Britain and France. So they, instead of doing a total ban, they just did a 2-country ban. And they banned Britain and France. Now the Embargo Act decreased in support from the Democratic Republican Party, but Americans knew they were hurt by this policy also. So they turned to the Federalists instead. And the Federalists, they were in favor of the close relations with Britain. So if you look at this picture, I believe you had this for a bell ringer today. And you can see that you have them, what is it, turtle, right? The turtle is biting. And so it's like that constant thing that holds them back, that act. Okay, now we're going to go into Madison and the War of 1812. First, let's look at our learning objectives. I need some volunteers to read our learning objectives. We have 4 objectives today. Charles is going to do number 1. Nathan is going to do number 2. Kate is going to do number 3. And Ethan is going to do number 4. Thank you for volunteering. Okay, you start.
So our first learning objective is we have to explain the reasons for conflict between white settlers and Native Americans during the early 1800s.
Number 2.
Identify the causes of the War of 1812.
Nice. Number 3.
Explain the challenges that the United States faced in preparing for war.
And the last one.
Describe the important events and effects of the War of 1812.
Thank you. So while we're looking over this section, we're going to focus on these objectives. What is our central question?
What is the essential question?
What should governments do?
I didn't hear you. Could you repeat that, please?
What should governments do?
Okay, so we will go on to the conflict in Ohio. In 1795, leaders of the Miamis and the other Native American nations signed the Treaty of Greenville. They gave up land that would later become part of Ohio. In return, they received $20,000 and the promise of more money if they kept the peace.
Next, we're going to cover the conflict in Indiana. The prophet and Tecumseh taught that white customs corrupt the Indians' ways. They said that many Indians depended too much on white trade goods, such as muskets, cloth, cooking pots, and whiskey. They believed that that could return to their old ways. The natives would gain the power to resist their white invaders. In 1808, the prophet built a village for his followers along Tippecanoe Creek in Indiana. This is in Indiana Territory. Indians from lands far away, as far as Missouri, Iowa, and Minnesota, they traveled to Prophet's town to hear his message. Tecumseh worked to organize the tribes of the Northwest into a confederation or an alliance. Do you remember when we talked about alliances? When we were in the American Revolution, who can tell me who our alliances were? We're 2 people. Say it. Go ahead. You can speak.
Spain and France.
Correct. Spain and France. All right. And so that was our alliance. So now he's working to make an alliance amongst his people. And they shared military command. He called for unity against the settlers. So here we have Tecumseh, which is a quote from him. It says, "The whites have driven us from the great salt water, forced us over the mountains. The only way to check and stop this evil is for all red men to unite in claiming a common equal right in the land. So before we talked about how the natives thought the land would be for everybody, but as they got pushed out, they decided to form an alliance to fight back. Now, Tecumseh was impressed by white settlers. So just like we see Britain impressing themselves on the English, the young English men, we also see a different form of impressment. All right, Governor William Henry Harrison grudgingly admitted he is one of those uncommon geniuses which sprang up unoccasionally to produce revolutions and overturn the established order of things. So there's going to be a big battle brewing between Tecumseh and the settlers. So take a moment, make sure you have these in your notes, and then we'll move to the next slide. A major battle at Tippecanoe. Now the rivalries between the natives and Tecumseh continued, and it united all of the Indians east of the Mississippi River. Still, the white settlers were alarmed at his success. They were pretty surprised that Tecumseh was able to unite as many natives as he did. So in 1811, Harrison marched 1,000 soldiers against Prophetstown at the Tippecanoe Creek. The prophet was in charge because Tecumseh was trying to organize Indians in the South. The prophet led a surprise attack on Harrison's troops. Both sides, they both suffered heavy losses in the Battle of Tippecanoe. This battle over the white settlements in the Indiana Territory. So when you're looking at the Battle of Tippecanoe, you need to know what it was over. So make sure you have that section. Are we ready to move to the next slide? You have this section, right? Okay. So now we're going to, after the Battle of Tippecanoe, we go straight into the causes of the War of 1812. So fighting with natives hurt relations between the United States and Britain. The British were supplying guns and ammunition to the Native Americans on the frontier. They also encouraged the Indians to attack the United States settlements. So at this time, Britain and America was still at odds, and they were not getting along. Remember, when we offered to take that total ban off, it was with both Britain and France, Napoleon actually agreed to our terms, but the Britain never did. So we have a long relationship, or a bad relationship, between Britain and America. So meanwhile, the ban on trade with Britain and France did expire, and here's where we're talking about Napoleon quickly announced that France would respect America's neutrality. Because in the beginning, Washington wanted neutrality. First, because we were not strong enough to fight, and second, because we were still trying to recover as far as debt-wise. We owed a lot of money to fight the American Revolution. Britain did not respond to the offer that America made, but France did. So now we are back in alliance with France. We're now allowed to trade with France again. We resume our trading, but continue to ban all the shipments with Britain. Do we have this, or do we need more time? We got it? Okay. Moving on with more causes of the War of 1812. Now, while Madison did not want war, other Americans were not as cautious. The New England anti-war feeling kind of ran strong. However, members of Congress from the South and the West who called for war with Britain before the War of 1812, they were known as the War Hawks. Now, the War Hawks were stirred by a strong sense of nationalism or a devotion to one's country. And I know that's a word that keeps coming up, and it will continue to come up, nationalism. Now, the War Hawks felt that Britain was treating the United States as if they were still a British colony. And remember, that's how we got to the American Revolution. They did not like their treatment. They did not like the tax that was put on them and the different acts that were put on them by King George III. So now they're back to feeling that same feeling, and they're going to get defensive. So then they were ready to fight a war to defend the American rights. Now the most outspoken war hawk has to be Henry Clay. Now Henry Clay is from Kentucky. Now Clay wanted to punish the British for seizing American ships. He also hoped to conquer Canada in the process. Here's a quote, and here it goes. "The militia of Kentucky are not alone. To place Montreal and Upper Canada at your feet," Clay boasted to Congress. So the Warhawks saw their advantage of the war with Britain. If Americans went to war with Britain, Warhawks said, the U.S. could seize Florida. And that's something that they had their eyes on, because they had all the area of the East Coast, and they wanted the tip, which would be Florida. Now, when we look back at it, they also pointed out that Britain was arming the Native Americans, so that's another reason that they were not considered an ally and they were considered an enemy. Because you were helping the people we were fighting against by supplying them with materials and encouraging them to attack America. Okay, are we good with this slide, class? Okay. I think you're gonna have to look in your section to see if you need to type this one, and you can start adding this to your notes if you need to. So it goes into more about the Warhawks, and it says that they felt that winning a war against Britain would bring a lasting safety to settlers on the frontier, because even though they fought the American Revolution, they were still battling against Britain. That was still the person they were battling, or the country they were battling. The United States and Britain drifted closer to war as the security of American ships remained an issue. The British continued to board American ships and impress those American seamen. To cut off the American trade with France, British warships blockaded some of the American ports. Now, in May 1811, near the New York harbor, a brief battle broke out between the Americans and the British. Now, the Americans crippled their ships, and they left 32 soldiers dead, and some of them were wounded. Now, the Warhawks urged Congress to prepare for war. Some people in Congress disagreed. Now, John Randolph from Virginia, he warned the people of the United States not to submit to be taxed for this war to conquest and dominion. Representatives of New England were especially concerned. They feared that the British Navy would attack New England seaports. At last, President Madison gave in to war. That war fever is what they called it. In June 1812, he asked Congress to declare war on Britain. Now, the House and the Senate both voted in favor of war. So Americans soon learned, though declaring a war was easy, it's much harder to fight a war or to win a war. And remember, we had not been in a conflict because of George Washington's neutrality. We're not in a conflict for a while. We remained neutral, but we kind of had no choice at this point. And since both the House and the Senate agreed, we knew that we were getting ready to go to war.